All right, guys, in this video, we're going to look at natural selection along with a couple other things. So let's get in here. All right, so some questions you want to make sure you can answer by the end of this. You want to know who Lamarck was and what Lamarckism is, how his theory of evolution is described. We want to know where Darwin came up with his initial ideas, what influenced some of his research, and we want to know the main points of natural selection. So let's start with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So Lamarck noticed evolution as he was a naturalist and came up with a hypothesis called acquired characteristics. And he thought that either by using or disusing certain organs, an organism could acquire or lose traits during their life, and then that's what they would pass on to their kids. Now, here's an important bullet point. He was wrong. Lamarckism, as it came to be known, is the idea that, giraffes are tall because they're always stretching their neck, right? And this is just not an accurate thing, okay? Just because your dad is a bodybuilder does not mean that you're going to be born just jacked out of your mind, right? So this is a great picture I found on the internet from the 80s. This guy clearly works out all the time. His kid does not look like a bodybuilder, right? So Lamarckism doesn't really pass the test, all right, pass the eye test there. Now, Darwin was a researcher who sailed on the HMS Beagle, a British ship. Went to the Galapagos Islands. Right, he was interested in studying biodiversity, and his studies led him to develop the theory of natural selection. Now, what are the points of natural selection? The first point is that variation exists within populations. This is something that Darwin observed. Right, and what we see all around us, right? Not every bird is the same size. Not every person is the same. We all have variation in our populations. The second thing he noticed was that organisms tend to over-reproduce. All right, so, you think about, like, I'm sure you've watched one of those nature channels or nature shows like Blue Planet or something like that, and you notice, like, the turtles lay, like, 50 eggs, right? Why do they do that? Well, the fact is that there is competition in the natural world because resources are limited. Okay, and so the more offspring you have, the better the chances that at least some of them will survive and pass on their genes. And finally, he noticed that the best adapted to their environment tend to be the ones that survive and pass on their traits. This is often called survival of the fittest. And we're going to talk a lot about what that word fit means in the course of this unit on evolution. So where does the variation come from? Well, we've spent a lot of time this year talking about protein synthesis and DNA synthesis and, crossover and meiosis, and a lot of, different ways that DNA is changed. But ultimately, the differences in individuals are based on their DNA and the alleles they inherit. So in theory, right, variation is a good thing. It drives change. It allows for adaptation, right, and it gives us beautiful stuff in nature, things like the birds of paradise. So there are 39 species of birds of paradise. You can see them here on the slide. They're all the same kind of species, right? They're all birds of paradise, but obviously they have great variation in their coloration, in their behavior, in their diets, all right, the time of day that they're active, all that kind of stuff. Here's another great example of variation, and this was actually a little bit more of a recent discovery. So peppered moths come in two main shades, right? Two main alleles for their colors. There's the darker peppered moth, which is really easy to see right here, but not so easy to see on this dark tree. And then there is the light peppered moth, which is obviously easy to see here, but blends in much better on this lighter tree. So depending on the prevalence of light or dark bark trees in an area, the peppered moth, certain variations or certain colorations in the peppered moth will make one allele better suited to survive in that environment. Now, over reproduction, right? Here's a fun activity. How many eggs will a female toad lay in her lifetime? I'll give you a hint. It's a bunch. All right. The common toad can lay 3,000 to 6,000 eggs per clutch, and they might lay clutches every year, every couple months, whatever it is. So 3,000 to 6,000 eggs per clutch. The more kids you have, the greater the likelihood of your genes being passed on, right? More offspring are likely to survive. But this is also a problem. It creates a resource shortage. If everyone is over reproducing, there's not enough resources to go around. If there's a resource shortage, you get competition, all right? So the idea behind competition is that the best individuals win their competitions and survive. Now, I have best in quotations for a reason. Best does not always mean the strongest. When we say survival of the fittest, it doesn't always mean the survival of the most fit, as in athletic or strongest. Sometimes it's the smartest. Sometimes it's the fastest. Think about human beings. We're not super fast. We're not super strong. All right. We don't have sharp teeth or claws or anything like that, but we've got a pretty decent brain, and that brain has allowed us to flourish, right? We have definitely won many of our competitions. You know, when you think about these two deer that we have here, obviously this is going to be a competition of strength, but this competition is not the only competition that these deer have to go through in order to make sure they reproduce. They've got to find a doe. They've got to be able to avoid predators, right? So speed is important. So they can't just be all muscle. They got to have some speed to them. They need to be intelligent enough to find shelter, and they need to be able to find, resources like water and food. They've got to know what not to eat. So there's a lot of different things that go into the description of fittest or best, all right, and how we win our competition. Now, when we talk about resources, we're talking about three main things. Food, which is definitely not unlimited. Mates, which is not unlimited, and there is a degree of selection that goes into this. And shelter. Shelter is also not unlimited, right? Better living space might be, safer, drier, warmer, etc. And even think about human beings, right? Is food unlimited for us? No. Are mates unlimited? No. Is shelter unlimited? No. Right? Is there definitely better versions of shelter out there? Sure. If you live on a 500-acre estate with a 20,000 square foot mansion, it's probably got a better TV room than, if you live in a mud hut in, under the shadow of a volcano, right? So there's definitely different degrees or different desirabilities in all of these different resources. Now, when we put all this together, we can talk about survival of the fittest. So fittest changes based on the situation. But overall, fit organisms are able to adapt to changing circumstances. So often we say the most fittest is the most adaptable. Now, the purpose of all living things is singular. They just need to pass on their genes. That's what life is. If you're living and you pass on your genes, you have been successful, right? That's the lowest, I guess, bar of success, right? That drive, though, is the thing that makes species interact with each other, with other species, with their environment. So it's a very important drive. There are a lot of ways to be fit. We've talked about a couple here, two more. So this monkey on the left, there are monkeys that use tools. In this case, this monkey is using a stone to smash this seed pod that it would otherwise not be able to get into. And on the right, this is actually, I believe in the Galapagos, there are iguanas that dive, hold their breath, dive down to, the mossy algae seaweed growth that is growing on the rocks in the ocean, and they don't have to compete with any of the other herbivores on the islands. They just hold their breath, swim down there and eat. So that is definitely a way for them to get resources that they don't have to compete for with other species. They're only competing with themselves, which that gives them an advantage. Now, there's natural selection even in bacteria, right? So it's easy to think about this just as a, big animal description. This actually is even true in bacteria, right? All the way down to the smallest living thing that we know or that we usually study. So in bacteria, you have your normal colony, right? Generation 1, all these green guys. This is Staphylococcus aureus. So this is the bacteria that will give you a staph infection if it gets in a cut. Over time, right, because bacteria are always, exchanging their DNA and replicating their DNA, so they have a lot of mutations that occur. A mutation occurs that we have right here in red. Then, first, let's say it gets in a cut or something, a doctor prescribes an antibiotic. Well, that antibiotic kills everything in green, kills them off. And that means that later on, the only thing that survived, right, was that red, mutated, antibiotic-resistant staph bacteria. And so over time, the population changes to where the majority of the population is red, and there's only a few of those green fellas left. So in this instance, it was a good mutation. This mutation here was a good mutation because it led to antibiotic resistance. So we see natural selection even at cellular levels. It's a very prevalent thing in nature. Now, how does natural selection tie into evolution? Well, let's look at the theory of evolution. It supports the idea that variation and natural selection are important to the survival of a species. It has a genetic basis for variation within species that's coming from mutations that we know exist in gametes and that are, that show up when there is sexual reproduction. And the modern species that we see today descended from older species and are therefore related. So we often call that descent with modification. So when we say descent with modification, how does that relate to what Darwin was studying? Well, he was looking primarily at these finches, okay? And the thought is, these are the finches that he sees today, right? Where did they come from? All right, did they all start out that way, or did they change over time? And so he looked at their diet. He looked at, if they behaved more like warblers or if they behaved more like finches. There was a warbler-like insect eater, which was very different than all of the finch-like insect eaters. And he compared their diet to the structure and function of their beaks. So, if you're going to eat insects, you probably need a sharp beak. You can fit in little holes in the trees and between the leaves and that kind of thing. But if you're going to eat seeds, you probably need a larger beak that is capable of crushing things. As he looked back and he found, different examples of preserved finches, he was able to kind of connect how they might have changed over time. Now, this is called the idea of common ancestry. And it's very important to a complete understanding of evolution because the fact is, modern species don't evolve from other modern species. Instead, they share common ancestors, which is some extinct species that they've both descended from. Darwin looked at the finches in the Galapagos to support his ideas, but today we can look at a much broader thing. And when we look at people, we can look at the family of monkeys, of primates, right? Monkeys is really not the right word, primates. So when we compare the genetic similarity, we find that the genus Homo, which we are, that's us, right? Homo sapiens, is closely related to the genus Pan with a common ancestor, right? Which is probably 6 million years in the past, right? So we're talking about an ancestor that lived 6 million years ago. To put that in perspective, recorded history for humanity is about 10,000 years long. So we've been keeping records for about that long. Not even. The little black, not the red, but the little black sliver I left in front of that dot. So 6 million years ago, we have a common ancestor. With gorillas, 7 million. With orangutans, 14 million. All right. If you go all the way back to lemurs, you're talking 63 million years ago. Well, the dinosaurs lived at 65. So, we're talking about a long, long time ago where you have that common ancestor. So, common ancestry is central to understanding evolution. Now, hopefully at the end of this video, you can tell me what Lamarckism is. You know the 4 factors that influence natural selection and Darwin's ideas, and you can describe natural selection and how it how it guides the change of species over time. If you have any questions, let me know. All right, and I'll see you guys in the next video.